His microphone. Alrighty, let's get going here. I think I got enough. Yeah, I think we're good. Turn the side lights off. It'll be all good. All right, welcome back, SOS 100. You go check questions here. Nothing at the moment. Okay, so I know at last class a couple of people asked when you'd be able to come review midterms. I am so swamped this week. Like, I'd love to have people come in and do it when it's still fresh in everyone's mind. I am so unbelievably swamped this week. And stuff just keeps getting piled on my plate. What was the class average for the midterm? It was like just shy of 80%. Like, very just shy. I answered that last time. I should never answer questions twice. So I'm going to say what I'm going to do is after reading week, I will have like another like half day where people can come in, like probably a Tuesday, like from like 12:30 till 4, where people can come in and take a look at their midterms. I'd love to do it this week. I just cannot do it this week. I don't have the time. So after reading week, I will set aside a particular day and I'll announce that well in advance. Why, thank you. How awkward. Will I be driving Lightning McQueen in Rocket League? Okay, I'm sorry. Is this like a special event? I haven't played Rocket League in like 2 weeks because I just have not had time. And my son has decided he wants to go back to playing Minecraft more often with me, and I hate Minecraft. Oh, it's so boring. Well, he also doesn't want to do the grunt work in Minecraft, so he sends me to dig for things. He's like, we need iron. Go mine iron. So I get to go mine for like hours and find iron. It's super fun. I have no idea what you're talking about, but I'm assuming it's a special package. If it costs money, then no, because I'm not paying money for imaginary cars. Did I intentionally make this midterm harder than the last because it felt that way? I did not, and people did better. Maybe it's just you. Sorry, sorry, being mean. Apparently, no. Like, people actually did better on the second midterm, so very much not. Okay, not you. I'm sorry. Maybe you didn't study as hard. I'm gonna go with that. All right. Okay. Let's go. Okay. So we ended off on this slide, right? We were talking about race, ethnicity, and some of the inequalities. So just kind of to remind, right? In Canadian history, from kind of Canada's founding on, we had this pretty, what's called a vertical mosaic, right? With white Anglo-Saxons kind of at the top of the hierarchy, and then people of other ethnic and racial groups further down. They had this perception of certain people as being white, who we would think of as white today. Certain people as not white, who we'd think of as white today, like Irish people and Italians. So we were talking about that. We were talking about how this equalized a bit through that economic kind of boom from the 1940s to the 1970s. Right, a lot of that inequality along racial and ethnic lines went away. Canada's governing class got more diverse as well, with more francophones, more people of different ethnic backgrounds than just the waspy Englishmen who had dominated until then. And then more, immigrants after the 1970s, particularly through the 80s and 90s, faced a much harder slog economically because the economy wasn't as good, and they weren't from sort of the Commonwealth and other European countries, and they had a hard time getting their their qualifications recognized. And we ended off kind of on this slide talking about racial and ethnic inequality, being more deeply rooted in social structures than in biology, right? Where often it is the way races are perceived and ethnicities are perceived and treated than any kind of component of their genetics or anything like that actually means that they are, subordinate classes rather than superordinate classes. And I think I gave the example of, I think we were talking about the NBA, and that's the example that I ended off on. How it's always, in a lot of cases, the people who end up, as professional athletes often come from, well, especially in basketball and baseball to a similar extent, come from those subordinate classes because lacking better opportunities, they put a lot of their efforts into one of the legitimate avenues they feel like they can succeed in, which is sports, right? And this was true of Jewish people, right? When the NBA was founded, it was dominated by Jews because Jews had little economic opportunity. As Jews, got more economic opportunity, got more education, and then eventually were considered white, we saw less and less, or fewer and fewer rather, professional Jewish athletes, but African Americans or blacks who still lack a lot of legitimate opportunities, right? Good education is hard to get, especially if you come from a place with poor public schools. A lot of them turn to sports as a legitimate avenue, which is why I say the NFL and the NBA are so dominated by black athletes. Though it is true that white men can't jump, that is not, sorry, this is the title of a movie from the 1990s. It's not necessarily true that black people are better at basketball. They just spend more time playing it, right? Okay. So, labels and identity. One of the things we know is that these categories, right, in terms of racial or ethnic identity, shifts in it are common, right? And these are actually much more malleable categories than we tend to think they are. So, I gave the example last time of how after the Russo-Japanese War, Japanese people who had previously been considered subordinate, right, because they were Asian, and Europeans considered Asians inferior to Europeans, when the Japanese defeated a European empire, the Russian Empire, in a war, suddenly they had to reconsider this, and Japanese people were made honorary whites, right? Because only a white people could beat another white people, clearly, or at least that was the thinking at the time. So we see these kinds of shifts in terms of what ethnicities mean, what races mean. Irish people who were considered non-white now obviously are considered white, right? And all of these sorts of things. And ethnic identities are even more flexible, right? And especially once you get into societies like Canada and the US, people can adopt or drop ethnic identities relatively easily, right? It's not uncommon, say, if we look at sort of the progression of ethnic identities, right? For in adolescence, young people to sort of want to shake off an ethnic identity, right? If they're Croatian, for example, right? In adolescence is a really typical thing that even though their parents speak to them in Croatian, they're going to want to answer their parents in English, right? And maybe not want to participate in, say, a Croatian identity. Why? Because they want to be part of mainstream culture. Usually what happens is as people enter sort of late adolescence and the emerging adult years, 19 to 29, basically, they will start to try and reconcile some of those ethnic identities and maybe readopt an ethnic identity, right? So it wouldn't be uncommon for people to be like, in their teen years, not want to sort of lean into ethnic or racial identities, but then come back to it as they reconcile their identity in those emerging adult years. You can thank Allard for the fact that now basically we think of 19 to 29 as not fully adult. You're an emerging adult. You won't be a full adult until you're 30. Okay, the social context and the nature of the relationship with members of other racial ethnic groups shape and continually reshape a person's racial and ethnic identity, right? Your racial and ethnic identity is always being cast against the other people in society, and you're shaping it and reshaping it accordingly, right? What does it mean to be a person of this descent will ultimately change. And you can see that too, like even world events, right? Things that happen will reshape the way people think of ethnic identities, right? For example, the collapse of the Soviet Union, right? When the Soviet Union collapsed, a lot of the ethnic groups that were kind of inside the Soviet Union that then became their own independent states saw resurgences in kind of ideas about their ethnic identities. Certainly, we saw that in Canada with Ukrainians, right? Ukrainians saw a great flourishing after the collapse of the Soviet Union of kind of an exploration of Ukrainian identity, which led, amongst other things in Alberta, to the formation of things like Ukrainian bilingual schools to sort of reclaim that language, which had been subordinate to Russian for a long time. Okay, I don't know if that makes sense. Did I answer that already? I think I did. Okay. So here's another example. Change your social context and racial and ethnic self-conception eventually changes too. Right, so this is an interesting example, kind of from the beginning of the 20th century, right? Italian immigrants, right? People who came from Italy, which really had only experienced unification of Italy, like we think of Italy as a country, but Italian unification is a relatively recent event. Right before that, it was a bunch of fractious states and papal states and all these sorts of things. Italian unification happens, I think, at the end of the 19th century, though I can't remember the exact year. So, in 1900, Italian immigrants coming to Canada and the United States, not the United Nations, the US, tended to think of themselves as from whatever region of Italy they were from, right? They were Sicilian, they were Tuscan, right? They were Romans, right? They were from a particular region of Italy, and they didn't think of themselves as Italian necessarily. Now, that doesn't mean they didn't share the same language, right? They all spoke Italian, at least in some form, right? Whether the dialects were slightly different in different places, but they didn't think of themselves as Italians. However, they came over to Canada and the United States, and when they got here, whether it's like in Montreal or Halifax or Ellis Island, they were labeled by their new countries as Italian, right? That, oh, you're all from Italy, you're all Italian, right? And so decades onward, right, as they sort of integrated, often kind of clustered together in communities, like if you go to, places like New York, you have enclaves like Little Italy, right, where a lot of Italians lived for a long time. I have it on this slide. Italy was unified in 1861. Once they came to Canada and they were and the US, and they were labeled as Italians, right? Eventually that coalesced into their identity here, because suddenly they were cast as all those people who speak Italian against the kind of hegemonic English-speaking society of their new countries, right? So they kind of were all like, well, you're Sicilian and I'm Tuscan, or Calabresian. I think it's Calabresian is the adjective. But we all are technically speaking Italian. We all, we have similar culture, even though regionally they're different. We all are kind of the same. So now we're going to start thinking of ourselves as Italian, right? Over time, it kind of stuck, and they reaffirmed their kind of identity as Italians. So that's happened to lots of different kind of ethnic and racial groups as they've come into new contexts, right? They have changed their identity, reshaped it along these sorts of lines. All righty. I don't play Fortnite. I barely have time to sleep. I don't have time for 2 games in my life. Okay, so what does symbolic interactionists say about this? Right, basically, kind of like, if you remember Deviance and Crime, we were talking about labeling theory, right? That something only becomes deviance or a crime once it is labeled as such. Basically, symbolic interactionists think much the same thing about race and ethnicity, right? Races and ethnicities ultimately are only meaningful when people are labeled as such, right? When we talk about, white people, we talk about black people, we talk about Asians or Chinese, right? These are all labels that we apply to human beings. And basically, we sort of make them meaningful by using them and believing that they mean something, right? And it's only, like, if we got rid of these labels, essentially, they would stop being meaningful. And, if a label stops being used, it stops being meaningful and people stop identifying with it, right? So things are like race and ethnicity are only meaningful in the fact that we've labeled them and we use them and we believe them to be true. That said, right, they're always negotiable, right? Because these things aren't genetic for symbolic interactionists, they're not genetically ingrained, right? There's nothing about, a particular identity, ethnic or racial, that is necessarily, indivisible, right? You can't change ultimately because it's not like essential. It's not essential to the person. It's just a label that's been applied, right? So you can negotiate it. You can negotiate what its meaning ultimately is and how it relates to the rest of society, right? So one of the things I would say, members of a group may have a racial or ethnic identity, right, on themselves, but outsiders may impose a new label on them. And then that group, then has to reject, accept, or modify these labels. Okay, so Indigenous people are an interesting example of this particular point, right? Because if you had gone back to, when Europeans first encountered different groups of Indigenous people, they all had their own labels, right? They had their own label, they were Cree, they were Iroquois, right? In particular bands, Blood. There's so many Indigenous groups in North America, Papasach, like there's tons, right? They all had this own label and they thought of themselves as this particular group or subgroup within, a larger kind of group of Indigenous people. When Europeans arrived, right, what did they do? They imposed a label on them, right? They called them Indians, right? Obviously not a acceptable word today, but that was the word that the Europeans used for them, right? So basically, they had their own labels, they had their own way of understanding each other, and then they had this label imposed on them from the outside, right, that they were Indians. Now, as time has gone on, right, and as social conditions have changed, this is something that, as Indigenous people have gotten more control over their own identities and how they identify, they've kind of reworked this. And you can sort of, I'm not that old, but when you've been alive as long as I have been, which is not that long, I've seen the progression of different ways that Indigenous people have tried negotiating these relationships, right? So when I was a kid, right, when I was, 10, 12, it would have been perfectly acceptable and common to use the word Indian. And it still is in the United States, right? People still call them American Indians, and that's seen as perfectly acceptable. And then, people started to use the word Native, okay? And that was principally driven by Indigenous groups wanting to kind of renegotiate that term. That one, had some pejorative attached to it. So eventually, it moved to First Nations, right? Indigenous people wanted to be called First Nations, and that's how people started to refer to them, right? Now, we moved through and it went to, from First Nations, which is still used, FNMI, First Nations, Inuit and Métis, right? That was used for maybe 6-7 years. And now we've sort of settled into calling them Indigenous people, right? But it's been this kind of process of Indigenous people, gaining more social power, gaining more kind of social control over how they are identified, and then telling, how they wanted to be identified, what words they wanted used, right? And it's been a kind of fitful process. It has been interesting. And as one of the interesting things about this course and talking about this concept is it made me sort of reflect on it and be like, what I saw and what, my racist uncles from Northern Alberta, always like, oh, they just want to change the way we talk about them. Why are they being like this? But it's this negotiation with identity, right? How do we want to be understood? What's our kind of identity? And it's been fitful, right? It hasn't been immediately settling on a term. And Indigenous people might not be the final term we end up using either. There may be other terms as Indigenous people keep negotiating their identity and how it relates to, the majority white or settler colonist or whatever you want to use as a term society, right? But it's going to be this constant kind of negotiation back and forth between the different groups. Okay. Yeah, negotiation between outsiders and insiders eventually results in crystallization of new and more or less stable ethnic identity, right? But that might not be permanent, right? So it might crystallize for a little bit. First Nations lasted a long time. And then it kind of goes through a period of shift again. And now, again, we've settled kind of on Indigenous people as the new word for Indigenous people. Okay. Yeah, if that social context changes again, the negotiation process begins again. And you can look at, say, the discussions around residential schools and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the papal apology and all these things as part of this process that's allowed Indigenous people, say, to renegotiate their identities. All right. That's an interesting question. Why do people still refer to Indigenous people as Indians when it's common knowledge they're not from India? Because words stick, even stupid ones. I don't know. I mean, it's so ingrained. It was ingrained in English for so long. And like I said, in the US, it's still pretty common to talk about American Indians as an appropriate term. And it's still on the census, right? Do they identify as an American Indian? That's still on the US Census. Or Native Americans, right? Neither of which would be acceptable in Canada. But, words stick and things are dumb. Also, as a result of human beings becoming more compassionate. Sure. You live in that fairy tale. Right. More compassionate. I'm not going to make fun of you, but that's cute. I don't think people are more compassionate. I think people are the same as they've always been. But I'm also a cynic and always have been. It's easy enough to turn a blind eye to terrible things going on in the world, as long as it doesn't affect you. Okay. Just for the what is like 1.5 million people being evicted from Pakistan back into Afghanistan to go undergo the tender mercies of the Taliban. That should be fun for those people, but you barely hear about it. So are we more compassionate? I don't know. I'm going to say no. Okay. Imposition versus choice, right? So just because identities are negotiable and don't really ever kind of fully crystallize doesn't mean that every group is going to have, equal chances to define their own identities, right? It's always going to be contingent on their kind of level of social power and the relationship between them and the rest of society, right? And there are various, variations in degree over time from one society to another, which people could exercise that choice. And even if in the example that I just gave of, the United States versus Canada, I think clearly in Canada, probably because Indigenous people are one of our most significant minorities, and in the US, it's historically been more Black people because of the history of slavery. Indigenous people have had much more kind of power to redefine themselves and define their identities in Canada. In the US, they've had much less, right? Which is, I think, why you still have those, in Canadian terms, slightly archaic terms for describing Indigenous people in the United States. And so it's not an equal freedom all the time. It's something that is always kind of fluctuating and contingent and based on social conditions, right? And if, social conditions change in Canada, Indigenous people might find themselves with much less power again or much more power. We will see in time. In a given society at a given time, different categories of people are more or less free to choose, right? This is going to shift over time again. So, flickery. This is a language is stupid comment. Okay, good. Okay, all right. So, someone's calling me. I hope that's not important. They can leave a voicemail. All right, so imposition versus choice. Those with the most, so according to symbolic interactionists, those who would have the most freedom to choose what their ethnicity or race is would be white Europeans, right? People from white European kind of backgrounds whose ancestors came more than 2 generations ago, right? In the sense here that they can ultimately either choose to embrace an ethnic identity, right, or shed it, right, and just be Canadian, right? And I mean, I remember having this sort of discussion with people when I was in high school, right? People who were like, I had friends who were of, say, Swedish descent, right? That was their ethnic background. They were Swedish, but they were, their families had come over, or German, right? Their families had come over some time ago from Sweden or Germany, a couple generations. Their parents didn't speak. And so for them, they were often like, I'm just Canadian, right? But they also would have been like, well, I'm German Canadian, right? They could grab onto that identity, or Ukrainian, or whatever it happened to be, right? They had that ability to sort of jump in and jump out of those particular kind of identities. So white people tend to have more of that ability because it's easier for them just to, omit kind of an ethnic or racial identification and just say, well, just Canadian or just American, right? No modifier, no, or not an apostrophe, a dash, right? Nothing, a hyphen, no hyphenated identity. For people who are obviously like visibly different, right? Who have a racial difference in terms of their appearance, that becomes much more difficult. And you hear this in some of the complaints, right? When people talk about like microaggression for people of ethnic and racial minorities, right? It's like someone, is Asian, right? And so people ask them like, oh, where are you from? No, where are you really from? Well, I'm from Vancouver. Oh no, but where are you really from, right? That's the kind of thing, right? It's harder to dissociate with that ethnic or racial identity because of those external markers, right? It's less easy to be like, well, I'm just Canadian, right? But where's your family come from originally, right? That would be a more kind of common question for people of racial backgrounds who can't as easily, just sidestep the question and claim Canadian identity because of kind of external signs. Okay, all right. Symbolic ethnicity as depicted by Riverdance. So what is symbolic ethnicity, right? Basically, symbolic ethnicity is a nostalgic allegiance to a culture of an immigrant generation that you do not belong to the old country that basically plays no role in someone's everyday life, but is sort of like put on here and there as needed, but isn't really kind of core to their everyday life. Okay, so what would this look like, right? So you probably, I don't know if you had Ukrainian friends growing up, mostly they were like, or Ukrainian Canadian friends growing up, and mostly, their daily lives were like everybody else's, but like, on Saturday they would go and be part of the Shumka dancers, right? So they would do Ukrainian dance on Saturday. The rest of their life was essentially the same, right? Maybe occasionally they made pierogies or holtsi, right? But mostly their lives proceeded the same. They had these like little ethnic components that they would sort of, they would make pierogies at Christmas time, or they would do Shumka dancing or like Irish dancing if you're Irish. But it was something that didn't affect their day-to-day life. It was just a symbolic ethnicity that they could kind of glom onto at particular moments that didn't really affect kind of their everyday life. That's symbolic ethnicity, right? And again, it's particularly easy for white Canadians a couple generations removed from immigration to have this sort of symbolic ethnicity, right? Francophones are bad for this too. It's like mostly your life is the same, except once a year you go to a cabane à sucre, right? You eat some frozen maple syrup goo, ride a horse-drawn wagon through the snow, watch someone fiddle wearing one of the ceinture fléchée, the French Canadian stereotypical kind of belts that they had when they were lumberjacks. And the rest of the time you sort of live your life as anyone else does, right? This is sort of symbolic ethnicity. Okay, how am I doing there? Yeah, so this is an interesting point. In America, there's been a debate amongst whether to use African American or Black American as the ethnic identifier. Like this has been, I think you see this where I need reading week. Slow down. What's that? Oui, oui, baguette. Okay, but that's not oui, oui, baguette. That should be OUI baguette. Like oui, oui, baguette is like us, baguette. Like, I don't understand. All right. Mon esti. Ma poutine. Okay. Can I? That is not a serious question, is it? Is that a serious? Could you say, is that a serious question? Can you answer if that's a serious question? Because I feel like that can't be a serious question. Okay, anyway, let's answer the black thing. The black, yeah, it's interesting, right? In American terms, the debate has been like African Americans would only refer to the people who came kind of from the population that was enslaved in the U.S. Those were African Americans. People who came after, tend to want to be identified as Black Americans. So it has been a debate. But blacks in the U.S., right, or black people in the U.S., are the biggest kind of minority, right? Well, I guess Hispanics, but they've been really prominent for a long time. So they've had this kind of debate as well. Okay, I guess Hispanics too. Hispanics have undergone a lot of different ways of identifying, right? It was Chicanos, Hispanics, Latinos, Latinx, right, have all been kind of terms that have been proposed for Latinos. The reason I use Latinos instead of Latinx, by the way, is because in polls, Latinos much prefer the word Latino to Latinx. Okay, so clearly you've never eaten a snail because they are delicious. I know, they don't like fast food. It's a stupid pun. All right. Snails are so good, though. I love them. Okay. Should I answer? Okay, I'll answer this. The original people who lived on a land, right? So in North America, we tend to think of, the people who were here before European colonization as indigenous. But it's a general word that means whoever was there first. Okay. So racism, I think we all know what racism is, right? The belief that a visible characteristic of a group justifies discrimination, right? You treat people unfairly, you discriminate them on the basis of their race. That is racism, right? Those visible characteristics, skin color or something else. Institutional racism, right, is what occurs when this happens at kind of a societal level where, there's organizational policies and practices in the institutions of the society that discriminate against people of racial groups, right? So a clear example of this would have been like segregation in the U.S. South prior to the 1960s, right? Then the passage of the Civil Rights Act, where, and all the way from there were white schools, right? Schools were segregated. People went to either a white school or a black school, right? And white schools tend to get better funding. Banks, which would not give loans to African Americans as easily as they gave them to white people, right? That was called redlining. And anything like that, anything that was institutionally kind of bound, that's institutional racism. So if one group tends to be disadvantaged by some kind of institutional policy, right, this would be institutional racism. Sometimes you talk about this in terms of something like the police or corrections or the courts, right, where courts have tended to give harsher sentences in Canada to Indigenous people, in the US to Black people for similar types of crime. People say there's an institutional bias or an institutional racism built into the court system. Okay, so other terms. Internal colonialism, involves one race or ethnic group subjugating another in the same country, right? Basically, it's something like apartheid. The South African policy of apartheid would be a sort of form of internal colonialism, right? Within South Africa, basically, Black people were segregated and kept from full participation in society, from certain jobs, housing, social contracts. You couldn't be friends with Black people. You couldn't marry between races. That's a form of what you might call internal colonialism. And then expulsion, another term, right? Basically, the treatment of Canada's Indigenous people by Europeans, would be a form of expulsion, right? Where basically Europeans came in, took over the land, and basically kicked Indigenous people off lands that they had occupied for millennia and forced them into reservations or forced them to move further and further away from European populations till there was no space left, right? And that's the forcible removal of a population from a territory claimed by another. So, the U.S. had a long history of this with Indigenous people as well, right? Basically, they had a series of what were called the Indian Wars in the U.S., where the U.S. Army, basically moving westward towards California, expelled indigenous people from lands that they had occupied. And very famously, right, they had what was called the Trail of Tears, where the U.S. Army essentially expelled a group of indigenous people and forced them to walk on foot to a new place that had been given to them by the United States. Many of them died along the way, which I guess is why it's called the Trail of Tears, right? But basically the forced removal of a population from a territory now claimed by someone else. Okay. Yeah, I mean, okay, so my last one was sorry, these are all conflict theory terms. So conflict theory, so I should say a couple words about conflict theory when it comes to kind of these racial categories and this way of thinking. Conflict theory almost always, understands racial conflict in terms of oppressor and oppressed kind of categories, right? Where a powerful group is the oppressor. And historically for Marxists, this has been white Europeans, right, or white people of European descent, have been the oppressors and those who are kind of subjugating other races. And then all other kind of peoples are typically subjugated in some way, right? And so they are the oppressed. This is almost always the way this works out in kind of Marxist terms. Okay, so like when we think of, indigenous people in Canada, right, from a Marxist or a conflict theory lens, it's always cast in the European colonizers, right, came, they settled, they colonized, and basically they attempted to obliterate indigenous cultures in a variety of ways. Now, if you look at the US, right, this was done militarily, right? The US Army, basically went to war with indigenous tribes and either, wiped them out entirely or extirpated them and forced them into, political settlements or treaties with the US government that were unfavorable to them, right? Which basically cost them a lot of their lands. In Canada, the government, especially with something like residential schools, had a slightly different policy, which was more about, assimilation, right? I can't remember what the historian's name is now, but it's this thesis about, what the crux of Canadian history is about three things. It's keeping the Americans out, keeping the French in, and pretending indigenous people don't exist or making indigenous people disappear. So Canada's had this long history of kind of, treating indigenous identity and the indigenous peoples as a problem that needed to be solved, and the tool rather than, sometimes it was explicit violence, but often it was through the tools of assimilation. And that's what the residential schools were all about, right? They basically were trying to, Christianize and then assimilate indigenous people so that they would no longer be a problem for the Canadian government, right? And the Canadian government saw them explicitly as a problem. Indigenous people obviously saw it differently, right? When things like the potlatch and the Sundance were banned, like traditional indigenous religious practices, they saw it as, and other things, right, as an attempt to obliterate their culture, right? And their languages when they went to residential schools and weren't allowed to speak indigenous languages. Okay. So, is this the last term? I think, slavery is the last term. Another term, genocide, right? And this is one I think we're hearing kicked around quite a bit now in the sort of Israeli-Palestinian conflict, right? People are talking about a genocide of the Palestinians. Genocide from a kind of a legal standpoint is the intentional extermination of an entire population defined as a race or a people, right? The attempt typically to kill them all, right? To get rid of them entirely. So you can look at, say, obviously the Holocaust would be the classic example of a genocide, right? The German Nazi attempt to kill all the Jews, right? That would be a genocide. The Rwandan genocide, where was it the Houthis? The Tutsis and the I can't remember the names now. It's escaping me. I want to say it's the Tutsis and the Hutus, and the Tutsis were trying to, essentially eliminate all of the Hutus. That's another genocide, right? But the goal with a genocide is always to kill the people. Now, when it comes to indigenous people in Canada, right, it's sometimes been referred to as a cultural genocide or the attempt to extirpate their culture. All right. I have no other question slides left, so I have to keep going back. Tutsis and Hutus, right, okay. I just saw that French people are so hardcore, but I didn't see the rest of the comment. the difference between internal colonialism and sorry. That's a grim image, but definitely the Rwandan Sudanese genocide. I know there was an attempted genocide against people in South Sudan. So I don't know. The Rwandan genocide. Rwanda. Okay. Rwanda genocide was the other way around. Okay, I couldn't remember which group was killing which. They eat pain for. Oh God. They eat pain for breakfast because the word for bread in French is pain, which is spelled the same way. You've been watching Loic Superville, I can tell. Okay, difference between internal colonialism and institutional colonialism. I mean, institutional colonialism is not really a term I've heard kicked around very much. I mean, I would imagine that it's like the explicit policy of a government to colonize a space, right? So what the Canadian government did when it moved into Western Canada would probably be institutional colonialism, though it's not a term I've ever heard. Okay, how am I doing for time? I only ask because everyone's walking out on me. By the way, no one ever notices, but I always try to match my watch band to my shirt. I've got like a whole bag of watch bands from my Fitbit. Now you'll notice every time. Okay, let's talk slavery. Slavery, I think we all know what slavery is, right? Ownership and control of a people. I think the example that most people are aware of is the ownership of African Americans or African people in the Caribbean and the southern part of the Caribbean, South America, and obviously the southern part of the United States, right? That there was slavery. Now, slavery's been kind of a feature of human existence, essentially for millennia, right? The whole Roman economy was built on slavery. So it's not a new feature. It's not certainly something that was invented, in 1619 or anything like that, or more likely 1550 when the Spanish discovered or kind of sailed and took over the Canary Islands. But definitely, I think the examples we tend to think of are those from the American South, right? And yeah, Canada, while we had slaves here, it was extirpated as a practice. We didn't have many, and it was extirpated relatively early when the British banned slavery in 1833. A little bit later in the U.S., it wasn't gotten rid of until 1865 with the end of the Civil War. And I think we all know the stories of Canada being the terminus for the Underground Railway of African slaves fleeing the U.S. government or the governments in the South. Okay. 4 minutes. Should I do that? No. Okay. You know what? There's a lot of information here about immigration policy. Let's pick it up on Friday. We'll finish up race and ethnicity on Friday, and we'll see what we do from there. Probably do the next subject or start it, and then pick it up after reading week. All right. We're here for a good time, not a long time. Okay. I'll leave those there. All right. Off I go.